and together prosecuted the case beginning in November 1945 and concluding 9 months later at the end of the summer of 1946. This proceeding is known as the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, which is an acronym you may hear in our discussion today. It concluded, and sentences were imposed and executions occurred in October 1946. Justice Jackson at that point finished his Nuremberg work and returned to Washington and to his Supreme Court seat, which he'd been AWOL from for the previous year. The work at Nuremberg, however, continued by an American prosecution effort. And there were subsequent trials, known as the subsequent proceedings, that were no longer international. They were American prosecutions. And there were a series of important trials over the next few years. Those proceedings were headed by the American Chief Lawyer General Telford Taylor. And so in today's discussion, you will hear about the IMT. State of Washington, he was a graduate, an undergraduate degree from the University of Washington, and then a law degree from Boalt Hall at the University of California, Berkeley. Mr. Harris in the 1930s began to practice law in Los Angeles and was doing so up through December 7, 1941, when the world changed. After Pearl Harbor, Mr. Harris enlisted in the Navy. He spent years serving our country in the Navy, and then toward the end of the war was transferred to the OSS to be a spy or an operative, or as he referred to it in passing yesterday in his very modest way, they trained us to fight with knives and things. Whitney Harris in the OSS, the precursor of course to today's CIA, and would that today's CIA did the work as well as that day's OSS appeared to. Mr. Harris was sent to London, and his assignment was to begin to gather evidence for the OSS for the prosecution of war criminals. In London, as Whitney Harris is doing this work, arrives Robert Jackson on the Truman assignment and the work of what becomes the London Conference, culminating in the London Agreement. And Mr. Harris becomes affiliated, first informally, later formally, with the Jackson operation. And through his talent and his work there, he's asked to accompany the Jackson project to Nuremberg and join the prosecution. At Nuremberg, Mr. Harris assembled the cases, the evidence against the Gestapo, the SS, and against an individual defendant named Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who was the chief of the Reich Main Security Office. Mr. Harris also at Nuremberg undertook a series of special assignments for Justice Jackson, and it's fair to say that Mr. Harris was a member of the near circle, perhaps the very inner circle of the Jackson Project. On January 2, 1946, Mr. Harris walked to the microphone at the podium you see in the photo display and addressed the tribunal. He was a trial lawyer in that proceeding, and he presented the evidence against defendant Kaltenbrunner. Mr. Harris was at Nuremberg through the verdict and the executions in October 1946. He then moved to Berlin, continuing to serve our country on the staff of General Lucius Clay, and was there for really what we now recognize as the start of the Cold War. The Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, and the momentous efforts there. So he rose from its broad shoulders. He was a graduate of the University. Mr. Meltzer worked for 2 years as the executive assistant to Jerome Frank, who was the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, a great legal thinker and writer, later a federal appellate judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. One tidbit that I will mention is that although Meltzer worked for Frank and the place was called the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Robert Jackson archives at the Library of Congress contain a very interesting memo, September 1939, written by Meltzer to Jerome Frank, concerning the... Now, I think the talent and the great minds of the New Deal went to the real projects. And that alone is interesting. What are securities lawyers doing analyzing war powers in 1939? But they knew what was coming and obviously had a serious issue, and a serious lawyer did a great analysis. The next step that's interesting is the cover memo, which is from Jerome Frank to Bob Jackson, who was Solicitor General of the United States. And it's a short memo that says, Bob, you should take a look at this. It's a good piece of work. Jerry. And so in that very early way, as a matter of legal work product, and he began at that point to seek to enlist in the military service. You'll notice his glasses, and it took our country a couple of years to let Bernie be a soldier. So in the meantime, He became a special assistant to Assistant Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and he became the acting chief of the Foreign Funds Control Division. In 1943, Professor Meltzer was finally an officer admitted to the U.S. Navy. He first served in Europe. He too became affiliated with the OSS, and he was supposed to go to China to contribute to its efforts in the Asian theater. He got as far as San Francisco in 1945, where he was present for the creation of the United Nations, and then, through a call from a former supervisor and senior lawyer and Department of Justice official, was asked to go to Nuremberg. And so he takes a right turn and heads east again, and is brought there to be part of this project. At Nuremberg, Mr. Meltzer worked on the economic case, which was the gathering and presentation of evidence against the German industrialists and bankers, the economic power behind the Third Reich. And on January 11th, 1946, 9 days after Whitney Harris, Bernie Meltzer walked to the podium, stood at the microphone, and addressed the tribunal in that momentous case. Bernie presented the evidence against Walter Funk, who headed Hitler's Ministry of Propaganda and Enlightenment, which is quite a bureaucratic title, and was present at Nuremberg and assisted in the work of the Jackson American prosecution team through the summer of 1946. Mr. Meltzer, too, left Nuremberg after the IMT case, and following that, finally got back to Chicago to begin the rest of his life. He returned to his alma mater, the University of Chicago, became a law professor, rose in its rank to be one of the stars of its faculty, to occupy the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Professor of Law chair on the faculty, and although he continued to write, teach, to be part of that staff. Professor King arrived in Nuremberg when the IMT trial was in progress, during early 1946, and at Nuremberg he first assisted with the work on that case and the preparations for what became the subsequent proceedings. As part of the preparation, following the convictions of principal defendants in the IMT trial, Professor King interrogated a number of the defendants. Among the people he interrogated were Hermann Goering, the former head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's former number 2, and Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect and friend and the former Minister of Armaments in the Third Reich. Speer, in Mr. King's perception, and I think in fact, was a much more interesting character than Hermann Goering. And Henry King developed what I think it's fair to call a relationship, and perhaps he even used the word friendship, with Albert Speer. Albert Speer was convicted but not given a capital sentence at Nuremberg, and so he was sent to the Spandau prison where he served a 20-year sentence. Henry King maintained and resumed contact with Speer when he was released from Spandau in the early 1960s, and Speer became a topic of King's important writing in this area. Now, I will step back to Nuremberg and the subsequent proceedings. Mr. King's role was to work after the IMT case on a range of important matters. He was a trial prosecutor in the case against Erhard Milch, who was Goering's deputy in the Luftwaffe. And so he too was a Nuremberg trial lawyer in the continuation of the effort following the Allied departure and the American continuation in the subsequent proceedings. Following Nuremberg, Mr. King began a legal career that included a very private and in-house corporate law practice. For many years, he was counsel to what is today the TRW Corporation and had really global responsibilities on a huge range of corporate legal problems for that and other clients. He is settled and is currently a resident in Cleveland, Ohio, and in addition to his law practice, he too, like former Professor Harris and current Professor Meltzer, followed the path to teaching in academia, becoming a professor of law at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Mr. King is known as an expert and teaches in the field of international law, the international issues that were obviously at issue at Nuremberg, and also a much broader range of issues. He is a co-chair of a U.S.-Canadian Law Institute and an expert on those transborder issues, in addition to war crimes and the things we're going to talk about. He knows an immense amount about international air and water and fishing and resource law and the things that really make for peaceful coexistence among nations. He is a prolific writer and a powerful speaker. His work on Speer has culminated in a wonderful book called The Two Worlds of Albert Speer, which evaluates the Nazi and the humane, intelligent, attractive man that Speer was, and tries to figure out how those could coexist. And that, too, is a wonderful piece of work. It's a pleasure to welcome Henry King to Jamestown. on my far left is Mr. James Conway. Mr. Conway is a lifelong New Yorker, born 1911 in New York City. He is a graduate of Fordham University, Fordham Law School, and has a graduate law degree from New York University. After his military service in World War II, Mr. Conway, seeking action and more relevant things to do with his legal abilities, I believe, applied to and was selected to join the legal staff in Nuremberg. He too arrived in the spring of 1946 while the IMT proceedings, the trial, was underway, and he got to observe Justice Jackson in the courtroom during that time as he too worked to assemble evidence and to prepare for what became the subsequent proceedings. Mr. Conway worked on preparing the cases in the subsequent proceedings, including the case that was brought against Erhard Milch, the case that Henry King prosecuted, Goering's deputy. Mr. Conway also had an interesting piece of Nuremberg work which occurred in Washington. He was sent from Nuremberg to the Pentagon to retrieve much of the evidence that had been developed and assembled by officers. And so they sent the evidence home really a bit too early. And so Jim Conway is sent to retrieve and to dig and to be a bit of an archaeologist, and pulls back to Nuremberg evidence that's used in the subsequent proceedings. After his work at Nuremberg, Mr. Conway returned to New York City and to law practice there. He led his own firm, Conway, Farrell, Curtin, and Kelly, for many years, and has had a distinguished career practicing insurance law and among many other areas.